Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling tales to ever reverberate through the Appalachian Mountains' shadows. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments section before we go any further, because few have ventured to the place where this story will take us. This video was made purely for amusement and is a work of fiction. Any similarity to real people living or deceased is entirely coincidental. Imagine this with me now. It is 1908. Eastern Tennessee's mountains rise like silent giants enveloped in a never-ending mist that appears to contain mysteries too old to be revealed. In the past, those areas were home to remote settlements, families who subsisted on the land and the resources found in the forest, and adventurers who dared to traverse paths that resembled open wounds on the terrain. Sevier County was one of those places where the law was more of a suggestion than a reality, where news from the outside world came weeks later, and where time had forgotten everything. Roads made of dirt wound between deep. Oak and pine trees covered the valleys and peaks, and in the winter the snow turned everything into a dangerous white maze. It was an incredibly beautiful place where nature was king and men were only passing through. The locals avoided talking about a property in this context. It was tucked away among trees so old that their trunks resembled pain-twisted faces at the end of a trail that ascended the mountain's north slope. The house was made of dark wood, with windows that, even on the brightest days, never seemed to reflect the sun. According to the elders, a man by the name of Elias Thornewood came to those lands from somewhere in Kentucky decades ago. Elias was an odd man with a sharp eye and few words who purchased the property at a price no one dared to question. Everyone thought he lived alone, at least. Locals occasionally reported seeing odd lights shining in the windows during the early in the morning, and some claimed to have heard unidentifiable sounds and distorted melodies that appeared to be produced by unidentified instruments. Nobody ever received an invitation to enter that home, and the few who did so out of curiosity returned, feeling uneasy for days. The so-called Thornwood Farm became the subject of stories told to ward off intruders and legends whispered around campfires. Nobody knew, but as we read this story together, we will learn that this property contained a far darker element than the mere eccentricities of a lonely man. With uncharacteristic vigor, the winter of 1908 was approaching, bringing with it a string of incidents that would alter that community's memory forever. Early November saw the first snowfall, which covered the trails and made the families who lived on the slopes even more isolated. Around this time, a journeyer by the name of Marcus Webb made the decision to cross the mountains in the direction of Knoxville, taking a path that went perilously near the Thornwood property. A pragmatic and cynical man, Marcus was a tool merchant who ignored tales of curses and ghosts. For years, he had been familiar with those trails and had never encountered any difficulties. However, something would be different on that trip. When the wind started howling through the trees, Marcus realized he needed to find shelter quickly because the approaching storm was stronger than any he had ever encountered. At that moment, he saw the dark outline of Thornwood House through the snow curtain. He was going to make a choice that would alter everything. Marcus experienced an odd sensation as he got closer to the house, a pressure in his chest that he couldn't explain, as though the air itself were heavier. Smoke was rising from the chimney, indicating that someone was inside, even though the windows were still dark. He waited after making 3 knocks on the door. The wind was the only sound to break the near-deafening silence that ensued. He was on the verge of giving up and carrying on with his dangerous journey. The door slowly opened to reveal a darkness that appeared deeper than needed. Marcus Webb took the first step toward something none of us could have predicted while standing on the threshold between the outside world and that enigmatic location. The narrative that starts here is not about what transpired in a single night, but rather about decades of secrets hidden in those mountains, decisions that reverberate over time, and the sinister nature that can lurk behind even the most commonplace doors. Obtain. Prepared. For this is only the beginning of the journey. You will be forced to reevaluate all of your preconceived notions about that era in American history as a result of what we will learn together. Even before he took his first step, Marcus Webb felt the cold air from the house touch his face as the door creaked as though it hadn't been opened in years. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if it wouldn't be better to face the storm than that unnerving feeling because the darkness inside was so thick, almost tangible. Quiet. At that moment, a voice came from the darkness. The voice sounded like a horse, taking a long time to speak. The man who spoke assured Marcus that the storm would not stop until dawn and invited him inside to warm himself by the fire. More out of need than choice, the merchant accepted the invitation and stepped through that door. The house's interior was just what one might anticipate from a place that had been abandoned over time. The corners were covered in dusty old furniture, cobwebs and blankets that shimmered in the fireplace's low light. It smelled of smoke and old wood and something else, something that made Marcus's stomach turn, but which he was unable to identify. The dancing flames partially lit Elias Thornawood's face as he sat in a rocking chair close to the fire. His eyes were so pale blue they were almost transparent, and he had white hair that fell unkempt over his shoulders. He must have been at least 70 years old. There was a disturbing intensity in that look. Marcus felt vulnerable, as though the elderly man could read his every thought. For a while, the two men conversed, exchanging the customary small talk between strangers compelled to be in the same room. Elias avoided talking much about himself, deftly sidestepping any personal inquiries, but he showed an almost compulsive interest in Marcus's life, his journeys, the places he was familiar with, and the people he encountered. Marcus started to notice odd things as the night went on and the storm raged outside. Information about the home. There were doors that appeared to lead nowhere and were secured with rusty padlocks that stood out against the surrounding rotted wood. Old paintings adorned the walls, depicting people with expressionless faces and eyes that seemed to track every step of the guests. Marcus noticed something that caught his eye in a corner of the room that was partially obscured by a ripped curtain. The steps of the staircase vanished into complete darkness as it descended to a location beneath the house. When? Elias merely grinned, a smile that stopped short of his eyes, and replied that some places were better left alone when he asked about it. Even though there was a crackling fire in the fireplace, the temperature inside the house seemed to decrease as the hours went by. Elias offered Marcus a blanket, which Marcus wrapped around himself, trying to block out the odd odor that soaked through the fabric. He felt like he was being watched every time he closed his eyes, and sleep came slowly. Around midnight, the noises started, a steady, rhythmic sound emanating from somewhere underground, like someone hitting a metal object. Startled, Marcus leaped to his feet, but when he turned to face Elias, the elderly man sat still in his chair, staring at the flames as if nothing had happened. With a voice that betrayed the anxiety he was trying to hide, the merchant asked about the noise. Elias took a long moment to respond, and when he did, his words were mysterious. Old homes have their own sounds, he claimed, their own recollections, and that some of them would rather not be heard until the darkest hours of the night. That night, Marcus didn't sleep. He counted down the minutes until he could get out of there, staying up until the first ray of sunlight came through the window cracks. He felt as though he was fleeing something he couldn't identify when he finally said goodbye to Elias and stepped outside into the snow that now blanketed everything in a silent, white blanket. Before the house vanished into the distance, he took one final look back. Trees. Watching him go, Elias Thornwood stood in the doorway. He was grinning strangely again. Marcus Webb was convinced at that moment that there was a serious problem with the location, one that extended well beyond a strange old man living by himself in the mountains. He was unaware that something that had lain dormant for decades had been roused by his visit to that house, and in the weeks that followed, the people of County Sevier would start to notice minute changes, indications. The Thornwoods farm was more than just a myth to scare gullible tourists. We will follow each one together to uncover what was actually concealed on that remote property in the Appalachian Mountains, as the story was just starting to reveal its deepest layers. A relentless winter that seemed intent on further isolating the communities strewn across the slopes of County Sevier arrived in the weeks following Marcus Webb's visit. As the snow accumulated in increasingly dense layers, the trails into almost unfeasible routes, making families rely only on the supplies they had accumulated in the fall. The first rumors started to spread during this time of seclusion. Abigail Harmon, who lived in a tiny cabin roughly 3 kilometers from the Thornwood property, was the catalyst for it all. In the area, Abigail was regarded as a sensible, realistic woman who was unaffected by superstitions or fantasies. People thus took notice when she showed up in the closest village with an odd tale, she described. That an unexplained feeling that something was amiss had awakened her in the middle of the night. She could see lights moving through the trees toward the Thornwood farm from the window of her bedroom. Instead of being typical lanterns or torches, they were a chilly blue light that pulsed at regular intervals, seemingly in accordance with a pattern or rhythm. Abigail spent nearly an hour observing the phenomenon. The lights appeared to float above the snow, circling a particular spot, and she was both fascinated and terrified. The lights abruptly went out, leaving only the darkness of the winter night, and they were impossible to recognize from a distance. Other locals started to report similar experiences in the days that followed. Thomas Belelford, a farmer, claimed to have heard voices chanting tunes in a language he was unfamiliar with coming from the direction of the Thornwood property. The story was corroborated by his wife, who also mentioned that their horses had been refused to calm down in spite of all the care she attempted to provide, remaining agitated throughout the night. The consistency of these accounts was even more unsettling. During that harsh winter, people who lived in different parts of the mountains and had no contact with one another reported nearly identical phenomena. Strange noises, bluish lights, and an eerie atmosphere that seemed to come from the ground itself surrounded the farm. Marcus Webb returned to Sevier County at this time. He had made it to Knoxville successfully in business terms, but he was still thinking about the night he'd spent at Elias Thornwood's house. He felt as though he had only seen the surface of something much bigger and darker, and there was something about that location that profoundly unsettled him. Marcus got a shiver when he heard the rumors that were going around the neighborhood. His experiences that evening were exactly in line with the residents' descriptions. The noises emanating from underground, the oppressive atmosphere, the sensation of having unseen eyes on you. He made the decision to approach Samuel Crenshaw, the local sheriff who had been in the position for more than 15 years. Crenshaw's response was unexpected because he was known for his practical outlook and disbelief in supernatural tales. The sheriff was silent for a few minutes after Marcus concluded his account of his time at the Thornwood farm, and his face took on a look that seemed to combine worry with fear. When he finally did speak, he disclosed that he had previously received complaints regarding that property. Over the years, a number of visitors have described unsettling encounters after passing by the farm, or, in the rare instances where they were compelled to seek refuge there, after spending the night under Elias Thornwood's roof. Some reported having vivid nightmares that plagued them for several weeks. Others expressed feeling as though they had lost something while they were there, something they couldn't recognize, but which left an unavoidable emptiness. Sheriff Crenshaw acknowledged he had never done a thorough investigation into the property. Every time he thought about it, something seemed to get in the way. He put off the visit for another day because of some inexplicable reluctance, a storm that prevented travel, or an emergency that occurred elsewhere in the county. Marcus grew increasingly uneasy as he heard all of this. There was a pattern there, a string of coincidences that didn't seem plausible. It appeared as though Thornywood's own farm had defense mechanisms in place to ward off potential intruders. The two men decided it was time to find out what was actually happening at that property. However, neither of them could have imagined that their choice would start a series of events that would uncover secrets that had been hidden in those mountains for decades. Outside, the snow kept falling, shrouding the entire planet in a pitch-white silence, and somewhere on the hillsides above the village, Thornwood Farm waited patiently as it always had, keeping its secrets hidden behind darkened windows and locked doors. The choice to look into Thornwood's farm was not made hastily. Sheriff Samuel Crenshaw was a meticulous man who was used to considering every option before acting, and he was aware that any hasty decision could have unanticipated repercussions. He therefore made the decision to do something he ought to have done long ago before ascending that mountain: examine the property's past, as well as the resident man. Land, birth, and death records were stored in dusty archives that few people bothered to look through at the Sevier County Registry Office, which was housed in a red brick building in the middle of the tiny village. Crenshaw spent 3 full days there looking for any information about Elias Thornwood by going through old, yellowed documents. His findings were profoundly unsettling as well as illuminating. Documents indicated that the property had been purchased in 1871 by a Virginia merchant named Cornelius Blackwood, who stated that he was looking for a more tranquil existence in the mountains. After living on the farm for a little more than 7 years, Blackwood abruptly left all of his possessions behind and left without telling anyone. Before Elias Thornwood showed up in 1886 with paperwork proving he had legally purchased the land, the property had been unoccupied for almost 10 years. Nobody in the neighborhood could recall seeing a sale take place, and the records from the registry office about this transfer were oddly ambiguous, as though crucial information had been purposefully left out. The total lack of information regarding Thornwood's past was even more fascinating. Although he stated that he was from Kentucky, there was no proof of his existence prior to his arrival in Sevier County, including marriage licenses and birth certificates. The man seemed to have materialized out of thin air, a shadow that assumed human form and then moved into that mountain home. On a chilly December evening, Crenshaw sat in front of a fireplace in the nearby inn and told Marcus Webb what he had discovered. The merchant paid increasing attention to every detail. His expression mirrored the sheriff's uneasiness. They both knew there was a problem with the entire situation: the absence of documentation, the enigmatic desertion by the former proprietor, and the accounts of odd occurrences that had accumulated over time. Everything suggested that there was a deep mystery beyond an eccentric, simple old man living alone in the mountains. Marcus then brought up a point he had nearly forgotten. Elias had noticed something strange on the mantelpiece during his night at the farm, while he was preoccupied with tending to the fire. It hung from a chain that looked too old to be from that era, a sort of medallion made of dark metal and engraved with symbols he didn't recognize. Elias abruptly shifted the topic when he attempted to inquire about the item, his face turning, tensed for a moment, then reverted to that eerie serenity that seemed to be his hallmark. Marcus hadn't given the incident much thought at the time. However, that detail now had a new meaning in the context of the sheriff's findings. Before facing Thornwood head-on, Crenshaw decided they needed more information. He requested any records that might be available about a man with that name or description by writing to registry offices in nearby counties and even some towns in Kentucky. The sheriff was prepared to wait weeks for answers. In the meantime, the farm's surrounding phenomena persisted. In the valley beneath the property, a family reported discovering odd footprints in the snow surrounding their cabin. These footprints did not match any known animal footprints in the area. Perfect circles were drawn around the house, giving the impression that something had been strolling around it all night. Eleanor Price, a widow who lived there as well, described seeing a figure standing at the edge of the woods, spending multiple nights in a row keeping an eye on her home. It was a tall, thin silhouette that stood still for hours, before vanishing just before dawn, as still as a statue. The figure's posture reminded Elenina of Elias Thornwood, but she couldn't be certain. Like a silent illness, fear started to spread throughout the neighborhood. People locked doors and windows more carefully than before, stayed inside their homes after dark, and talked among themselves about the curse that seemed to. It must have happened to those mountains. Unable to wait while the mystery grew more complex, Marcus Webb made the decision to look into it himself, in order to gather any stories or memories that might provide insight into what was going on. He started speaking with the locals who had been there since before Thornwood arrived. He met Henrietta Marsh during one of these discussions. She was an 80-year-old woman who lived in a remote cabin on the far east side of the county. Henrietta was renowned for both her exceptional memory and her familiarity with the old customs of the mountains, which had been passed down through the generations since the first settlers. The old woman's face became noticeably paler when Marcus brought up the Thornwood farm. As if she was afraid someone would hear them, she asked him to enter her home and shut the door. Then, with a voice that was a little shaky, she started to tell a story that would totally alter Marcus's viewpoint on everything that had taken place. Henrietta Marsh took a seat by the window in a rocking chair. Her old eyes were fixed on a far-off object that only she could see. Around her, the cabin was plain, with only necessities and a few old, faded pictures on the wooden walls for decoration. The old woman's recollections seemed to come to life as the fire flickered softly in the fireplace, creating dancing shadows. She started off by explaining that her family had spent many generations residing in those mountains. Since the earliest settlers came to that area of Tennessee in quest of a life away from the expanding cities and fertile land, her grandmother told her the tale of the land where Thornwood Farm now stood, and her grandparents had constructed the first cabin in that valley. Oral tradition passed down from mother to daughter in that family states that the people who lived in the area prior to the arrival of the Europeans always regarded that particular piece of land as cursed. Colonists, because they believed that the veil between the worlds was too thin and that things that shouldn't exist could pass through to the side of the living, the natives shunned that area with a fear that was almost religious. Marcus was intrigued and skeptical at the same time as he listened to this introduction. As a businessman, he was used to handling real-world facts and transactions. However, Henrietta's remarks carried a weight that went beyond simple superstition. There was genuineness in her voice, a sincere fear that had not been dispelled by decades. The elderly woman went on to say that the first settlers established a small community on that hillside despite the warnings. Everything appeared to be normal for a few years. Harvests were bountiful, families prospered, and life went on as it naturally did. However, things started to change around 1843. People in that community started reporting unsettling dreams. Nighttime visions so intense they appeared more real than they were during the day. They all had similar dreams. Something, a darkness that breathed, moved, and called to them with voices that promised powers beyond human comprehension and knowledge that was forbidden. Some people had odd marks on their bodies when they woke up. These were unidentifiable symbols that vanished after a few days. Josiah Crane, a preacher who had brought his congregation from North Carolina in search of a location where they could peacefully practice their faith, was the community's leader. Josiah was revered for his devotion and wisdom. Additionally, when the phenomenon started, everyone turned to him for direction. Nobody anticipated the change that would take place in that man. Josiah started to withdraw, spending days alone in his hut and refusing to eat or socialize. Upon his eventual appearance, he had a new, aloof look in his eyes, as though he were gazing at something that was invisible to others. Henrietta stopped talking, her creased fingers clenched around the chair's arm. She clarified that what transpired next was her grandmother was always reluctant to share a portion of the story, not because she didn't think it was true, but rather because she was afraid of what would happen if she said certain things out loud. Josiah Crane started giving sermons on various topics. He spoke of acceptance and submission to forces he said predated time itself, rather than hope and redemption. He talked about passageways and portals, about beings that had been watching people since the beginning of time, waiting for the ideal opportunity to reclaim what they believed to be legitimately theirs. There was division in the community. Some followers stuck with Josiah because they were enticed by his claims to wisdom and power. Others ran away, leaving behind their homes and belongings, never to be seen again. Although Henrietta's grandmother was only a young child at the time, she vividly recalled the night her own family departed, leaving behind everything they had created and only bringing what they could in their arms. It was never entirely clear what became of those who survived. The community just stopped. When other settlers eventually ventured to look, they discovered its huts deserted and empty. There was only the utter quiet of a place that had been abruptly abandoned. No indications of conflict or obvious tragedy. The older locals attempted to warn Cornelius Blackwood about the area's history when he purchased the land and constructed the home that is now Thornwood. Blackwood dismissed their worries as the superstition of uninformed people and laughed at them. For 7 years, he appeared to be correct, residing on that property in peace and without any notable incidents. Then he left, giving up everything, just as the followers of Josiah Crane had done decades earlier. Henrietta knew right away that the cycle was repeating itself when Elias Thornwood showed up to replace him. There was something about that man, something in his presence and gaze that mirrored the descriptions her grandmother had given of Josiah Crane all those years ago. Marcus didn't say anything for a while, once Henrietta had completed her tale. The cabin was now completely dark, with only the orange glow of the fire providing illumination. Among the dozens of questions he had, one was particularly noteworthy. Why hadn't she mentioned this to anyone before? Why hadn't she alerted the neighborhood to Thornwood's potential threat before letting him occupy that land for more than 2 decades? Henrietta's response was straightforward but horrifying. Over the years, she had made numerous attempts, but each time she was about to speak, something stopped her. A minor accident, an unexpected illness, or a crippling fear that immobilized her speech. It seemed as though the farm itself was aware of her plans and took action to keep her quiet. With a tremor in her voice, she stated that there was only one meaning to the fact that she could now narrate the story. There was a change. Perhaps it was already too late to stop what was about to happen, but whatever had been dormant on that property was beginning to awaken. Henrietta Marsh's cabin was abandoned by Marcus Webb, who took his. Mind whirling in a tornado of opposing ideas. A part of him wanted to write off everything he had heard as the ramblings of an elderly woman who had spent too much time alone in the mountains, but another part of him, the part that had experienced the oppressive weight of Thornwood House on its own skin, knew that those old words were true. The return trip to the village was quiet and drawn out. The snow had ceased to fall, revealing a white blanket that gleamed in the crescent moon's dim light. The trees created lengthy shadows on the walkway, and Marcus couldn't get rid of the impression that he was being watched by invisible eyes that were concealed in the forest's shadows. Sheriff Crenshaw was waiting for him at the inn when he finally got there, his face displaying a mixture of urgency and worry. Nothing positive was in the news. 2 more locals had come to the sheriff with unsettling information regarding the Thornwood farm while Marcus was away. The first was Walter Hurricks, a hunter who was strong and brave individual who preferred the woods to his own house. Following the footprints of a deer he had been pursuing for hours, Walter had ventured close to the Thornwood estate. He gave up the hunt after discovering what he had and fled back to the village without turning around. The snow had melted completely in a perfect circle that stretched for dozens of meters around the farm. Strange vegetation, dark green plants that shouldn't be there in the middle of winter, covered the exposed ground in seemingly formed patterns. Symbols when seen from a distance. Even without any wind, Walter vowed, the plants moved a little, as though they were breathing. Clara Hutchkins, a woman who ran a modest supply store in the village, provided the second account. Elias Thornwood had paid Clara a visit that morning, the first time the elderly man had descended from the mountains in months. He walked slowly and deliberately into her store, his pale eyes looking around the shelves as though he was looking for something. What? After years of being his only source of supplies, Clara had become accustomed to Thornwood's peculiar behavior, which did not disturb her. That's what he said before heading out. She could hardly hear the words, but they were engraved like a branding iron into her memory. He claimed that the times were changing, that everyone would soon realize the real purpose of that land, and that the wait was coming to an end. Then, with that eerie grin that never made it to his eyes, with just a bag of salt and a few black candles that Clara couldn't recall having in her inventory, she fled the store and vanished into the snow. Marcus told Crenshaw everything Henrietta Marsh had taught him. As the story progressed, the sheriff listened in silence, his expression growing more solemn. The weight of the revelations hung between the 2 men like a dense fog, and they were silent for a considerable amount of time after Marcus finished. It was Crenshaw who spoke first. He claimed to be able to. Don't put off going to the Thornwood farm any longer. There were growing reports. The community was becoming more and more afraid. Additionally, it was his duty as the county sheriff to look into the situation. He wanted to know if Marcus would be willing to join him on his planned ascent of the mountain the following day as soon as the sun rose. The merchant was taken aback by the question. Every instinct in his body told him to decline the invitation, gather his belongings, and leave because he didn't want to go back to that house. Never to return to that county. However, a need to comprehend what had happened that night and to find answers to questions that prevented him from sleeping soundly outweighed his fear. He agreed, and without realizing it, he had sealed his doom in a way he could never have predicted. It was one of the longest nights Marcus had ever known. In his room at the inn, he lay on his bed, but he was unable to fall asleep. Every time he shut his eyes, Elias Thornwood's face, that mysterious smile, and those pale eyes that seemed to see right through his barriers. Marcus was awakened at around 3 a.m. by a sound that chilled him to the bone. Distant but distinct voices were singing, entwining in a melody that seemed to emanate simultaneously from all directions. The music was hypnotic and disgusting, lovely and terrifying, and before Marcus knew he was awake, he was heading for the window. Outside, in the direction of the mountains, the bluish light in the sky pulsed in time with the singing. The landscape appeared to belong to a different world, one where the laws of nature did not apply, because the light was strong enough to illuminate the snow-capped peaks. Marcus has no idea how long he watched that impossibility unfold in front of the window, paralyzed. By the time he was able to move, the light had gone out and the night had become quiet again. However, he was aware, with complete conviction that what he had seen was not an illusion or a dream. At Thornwood Farm, something was taking place that had been planned for decades, if not centuries, and was now finally coming to an end. He and Sheriff Crenshaw would walk right into the center of that mystery when the sun rose that morning, unsure if they would be able to handle what they would discover. When dawn finally arrived, it was gloomy and chilly, with thick clouds obscuring the sky and threatening more snowfall. Prior to the end of the day, in front of the inn, Marcus Webb met Sheriff Crenshaw. They both had tense expressions and were dressed in bulky clothing. Both of them had slept poorly, and the weight of the decisions that lay ahead was evident in their weary eyes. Crenshaw showed Marcus something he had brought with him before they departed. Beside it was a small book bound in dark leather that had belonged to his father, and an old pistol kept in a leather holster that had seen the effects of time. "Grandfather," the sheriff said, a man who had spent his entire life in those mountains and who had gathered tales and information about the area's oldest sites. Crenshaw wanted Marcus to see a particular page. It had a hand-drawn sketch of odd symbols on it, the same symbols Walter Harris had mentioned when discussing the plants on the farm, and it was identified by a faded red ribbon. A single sentence in unsteady handwriting beneath the illustration said that those places where the land had been consecrated for unspecified purposes were indicated by signs. The two men looked at each other intently. No additional words were necessary for them to comprehend the seriousness of their predicament. Thornwood's farm was tied to something far more profound and ancient than a mere eccentric man living alone in the mountains, regardless of the truth behind it. Each step on the steep and dangerous trail that led to the property required balance and caution due to the layer of ice covering it. As they ascended, the forest silence became more and more deafening. Only their own breathing and the sporadic cracking of branches beneath their feet could be heard. There was no animal movement among the trees or bird song. The first person to notice the shift in the vegetation was Marcus. There was a perfect circle around the property where snow just didn't exist, just as Walter had described. Those weird plants were all over the bare ground. Growing in spirals and patterns, the leaves were so dark green they nearly looked black. Disregarded all botanical reasoning. Crenshaw bent to take a closer look at the plants, but he was hesitant to touch them. That vegetation felt like it didn't belong there. Maybe not even in that world, and there was something deeply wrong with it. Even without a breeze, the leaves moved softly, and when the sheriff extended his hand, they appeared to lean in his direction as though sensing his presence. He hurried to his feet and gestured for them to go on. Now that Thornwood House was in plain sight, its dark wooden building that rises like a monument to lost secrets against the gloomy sky. The old man was home, waiting for them as though he knew they were coming, as evidenced by the smoke rising languidly from the chimney. When they arrived at the porch, the front door was ajar. Crenshaw repeatedly called Thornwood's name, but no one responded. After exchanging a nervous look, the two men pushed open the door and went inside the location that had been on Marcus's mind ever since his first visit. The inside of Marcus's recollection of the house was different. The dusty window panes let in the dim daylight, and the curtains had been pulled aside. The main room's center was empty, with the exception of something that stopped both men in their tracks. The furniture had been pushed to the corners. An intricate circle with the same symbols Crenshaw had shown Marcus in his grandfather's book was drawn on the wooden floor using what looked like white chalk mixed with something darker. The illustration was. Each line was drawn with a precision and intricacy that suggested years of practice and in-depth knowledge. Dozens of black candles were placed at regular intervals around the circle, their flames burning in perfect silence, without flickering, as though the air itself were motionless within that house. It was hard to pinpoint the odor that pervaded the space. A blend of moist earth, ancient incense, and something metallic that made the stomach turn. Crenshaw pulled out his gun and slowly moved across the room, looking for any indication of movement in every shadow. Torn between the need to finish this and the desire to run, Marcus stayed close to the door. He had put too much effort into this mystery to just give up on it now. At that moment, Elias Thornwood's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once as it reverberated through the house's walls. The elderly man did not yell. His voice had a resonance that seemed to vibrate in his calm, measured, almost gentle voice. Whoever heard it would have their bones. He claimed to have waited a long time for that moment, that each and every guest who had entered his home over the years had unintentionally contributed to the impending event. That the farm was more than just a dwelling. It was a doorway, a key to something that existed before time and would persist long after humanity had vanished from the face of the earth. Despite the obvious fear in his voice, Crenshaw insisted that Thorne reveal himself. The answer arrived, in the shape of a long, low laugh that seemed to trickle down the walls like water, its eerie presence permeating every nook and cranny of the house. Then, gradually, one of the locked doors Marcus had seen on his first visit started to open, revealing a room that was not like any other. Rather, it was a pitch-black space that seemed to absorb the light surrounding it. A figure started to appear out of that shadow, and what the two men witnessed at that precise moment would permanently alter their perception of what was possible in that world. Elias Thornwood was and was not the figure that stepped out of the shadows. Years had bent that lean silhouette, but the body remained the same. However, there was a fundamental difference in his presence. He had a fluidity of movement that belied his apparent age. He took deliberate, exact steps, as though he were sliding across the floor rather than walking. His once pale, unsettling blue eyes now glowed with a special brightness, a chilly light that didn't come from anywhere. He had a smile that seemed to transcend the bounds of a human face, turning his expression into something that was almost unreal. Crenshaw's hands were clearly shaking, but he continued to aim his gun at the elderly man. His voice trailed off a little on the final words, but he ordered Thornwood to stop and explain what was going on in that house. The presence that filled the room seemed to overshadow the authority he typically carried as sheriff. Thornwood complied, pausing in the middle of the circle that was sketched on the floor. For a brief moment, the candles surrounding him grew brighter, their flames expanding a few inches before contracting back to their initial size. He started talking, and his voice had layers that had not been present before, as though several people were speaking simultaneously through one mouth. He recounted an alternative tale to the one Henrietta Marsh had told Marcus, one that was viewed from the perspective of those who had willingly accepted what was that territory. Thornwood claimed that Josiah Crane's community had been part of a ritual that had been planned for generations, rather than being the victims of a curse. He clarified that the farm had been constructed on unique land. It was one of the few places on Earth where it was possible to cross the boundaries between the various planes of existence. People in the past were aware of this and shunned the area out of fear, but some people always saw opportunity where others saw danger. Among them was Josiah Crane. Visionaries. Contrary to what the legend claimed, he had awakened to a reality that few were willing to acknowledge. In the traditional sense of the word, his remaining followers had not vanished. They had passed through the veil and arrived at a place where space and time operated entirely differently. Marcus was fascinated and horrified at the same time as he heard those words. He was confronted by a man who was obviously disturbed, and a part of his logical mind cried out that this was not possible, created a complex fantasy over decades of seclusion. But another part, the part that had sensed the peculiarity of that house from the outset, saw an unavoidable truth in those words. Thornwood went on to describe how Cornelius Blackwood had unintentionally uncovered some of the property's secrets by discovering papers and artifacts that Crane's community had left behind. He fled, terrified by what he had discovered, but not before closing some doors that ought to have remained open. The appearance of Thornwood was no accident. He had been looking for that location for years, following hints in fractured accounts and obscure writings. He knew his search was over when he eventually located it. He spent the ensuing decades undoing Blackwood's actions and laying the foundation for the ritual that Josiah Crane had started so many years ago. Each and every guest who had entered that home had helped achieve that goal, not intentionally, of course, but through something far more nuanced. Thornwood talked about the life force and energy that every person possesses and leaves behind wherever they go. Over the years, he had gathered these traces, stored them, and cultivated them in the same way that a farmer grows his crops. At last, the harvest was ready. Crenshaw's question reverberated through the empty room, interrupting Thornwood's monologue. He was curious about the outcome and the ultimate purpose of this complex ritual. The response he received was frightening and ambiguous. Thornwood talked about a reunion, a meeting between people who had waited on the other side and those who had left decades ago. He claimed that the conditions were ideal, the veil was thinner than before, and the barriers would completely fall before the end of that winter. What would happen next? It was beyond his comprehension, he acknowledged with that eerie smile. He served only as a tool, a facilitator, and a watchman over the door that would soon be opened. What would come through that door was something that was beyond the realm of human language. Marcus's legs grew weaker. In an attempt to take in what he was hearing, he leaned against the closest wall. Everything appeared to be insane, the madness of a mind weakened by obsession and loneliness. But there was more to this story than just fantasy, as evidenced by the lights, the songs, the impossible plants, and the phenomena he had seen. Crenshaw approached Thornwood with bravery Marcus was unaware he had. He said that no matter what the old man insisted that Thorn go with him to the village to answer questions regarding the disturbances impacting the community because he thought he was there as a law enforcement official. Thornwood's response was surprising. He didn't put up a fight, make threats, or display animosity. He merely said he would be happy to go with the sheriff, inclining his head in an almost amused gesture. Ultimately, he clarified with unsettling composure, it didn't matter where his physical. The body was. The ceremony was over. The pieces were in place, and what would come next would happen regardless of his presence. It was at that moment that Marcus noticed something that had escaped his attention until then. The symbol on the ground now pulsed with its own light, as if it had absorbed the light from the flames and changed into something else. The candles surrounding the circle had gone out one by one during the conversation, additionally coming from the rear of the house. Beyond the open door, in the darkness, a sound started to come out. It was a deeper, older vibration that seemed to make the walls themselves tremble in resonance, rather than the singing they had heard previously. With every second that went by, the vibration from the depths of the house intensified, turning from a barely perceptible murmur into something that was felt in the teeth and bones in the very middle of the chest. Marcus clung to the wall, attempting to keep his balance as the floor seemed to pulse as though it had its own life beneath his feet. Despite both of them knowing that piece of metal would be useless against whatever was happening, Crenshaw instinctively backed away, his weapon still aimed at Thornwood. The elderly man stood still in the middle of the glowing circle, his brilliant eyes fixed on something outside the house's walls and the visible world, as though he had access to dimensions that others did not. The darkness outside the door started to move at that moment. It wasn't an normal motion, something that could be explained by normal language. It seemed as though the very lack of light had taken on a life of its own, evolving into a living, breathing thing that gradually grew larger until it reached the room containing the three men. Unrelated to the winter weather, Marcus felt a chill run through his bones. It was an internal chill that coursed through his body like cold water coursing through his veins. His ideas became jumbled and disjointed, as though his mind were being tugged simultaneously in several directions. Whispers started to come from all around him. He heard dozens or even hundreds of them speaking in languages he didn't understand, but he was able to comprehend them on a level that went beyond words. They described worlds that existed before the stars and would persist long after the last sun had set, as well as time and eternity. They described passageways and portals where creatures lived in the voids between areas, waiting for the barriers to eventually give way. Manner. Something Marcus couldn't understand was shouted by Crainaw. The sheriff was now on his knees, trying in vain to block out the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere by pressing his hands to his ears. In the face of forces that could not be defeated by gunpowder and bullets, his gun had fallen to the ground, forgotten. With his arms extended as though he were being embraced by an unseen hand, Thornwood observed everything with a look of calm ecstasy. His creases, his stooped posture gradually straightened, as if decades of age were being stripped away with every second, and his face appeared to be softening. He chanted words in a rhythmic cadence, blending into the surrounding whispers to become a part of that unattainable symphony. Marcus was aware that they had to leave. His body refused to comply with the desperate urgency with which every fiber of his being screamed this truth. His muscles remained unresponsive, seemingly immobilized by an outside force that kept. He was imprisoned there. He glanced at the front door, the one they had used to enter, and realized that it appeared to be miles away now. A tiny gray light rectangle at the end of a hallway that was too long. Around them, the house was changing, its dimensions warping in ways that defied reason and logic. Something unexpected occurred during this time of complete despair. His grandfather's little book dropped from Crainaw's coat pocket and opened to a page Marcus hadn't previously observed. He could distinguish one symbol from the others even at a distance. It was a pattern that appeared to glow with its own light, faint but steady. He couldn't quite put his finger on why he was drawn to that symbol. It seemed as though a quiet voice was speaking in his head, directing him and pointing the way through the chaos that had taken over his mind. He struggled mightily to move his arms, pulling his body in the direction of the fallen book. Thornwood became aware of the motion, and, for a brief moment, his chanting faltered. Something in the air broke during that brief pause. A break in the flawless harmony he had worked so hard to create. The growing darkness appeared to recede a little, and the whispers surrounding him faltered and became discordant. Marcus grabbed the book and pressed it to his chest, staring at the shining symbol on the page. He was unsure of how to handle it. He knew nothing of incantations or rituals. However, something in his most basic instinct informed him that this item possessed a power that could change that unachievable circumstance. Thornwood left his position in the middle of the circle and walked over to Marcus, his face now twisted in a look that combined anger with what appeared to be fear. His voice lost that unearthly serenity and took on an urgency that betrayed the significance of that item as he told the merchant to put down the book. Marcus struggled to stand, his legs still unsteady, but at last he obeyed his orders. With the symbol facing Thornwood, he held the book in front of him like a shield and saw the elderly man back away, as though he had been hit by an invisible force. The response was dramatic and instantaneous. The circle on the ground started to pulse erratically, its light varying in intensity and dimming at irregular intervals. The murmurs turned into cries of annoyance, voices conveying a long-standing and intense rage at this unforeseen challenge. Crainaw took the chance to grab his weapon and get to his feet, standing next to Marcus. The impossible hallway seemed to be shrinking with each step as two men moved slowly toward the front door, which now appeared to be returning to its normal size. In a language that no human should be able to speak, Thornwood yelled words that seemed to shatter the atmosphere and leave invisible wounds in their wake. Behind him, the darkness moved forward once more forcefully, attempting to swallow the two intruders before they could get away. However, the book's symbol grew brighter and brighter, forming a sort of wall between them, and that force that invaded. Marcus didn't know how or why, but he knew they would be safe, at least momentarily, as long as he kept that book in front of him. In one motion, they arrived at the door and went out onto the balcony. Though it felt like a slap to their faces, the cold winter air was a welcome reminder that they were still in the real world, and that there was more out there than that damned house. Their feet crushed those as they dashed through the ring of odd vegetation. Dark plants without turning around. The branches of the tree appeared to be reaching out to seize them, but they were moving too quickly due to the intense fear that was coursing through them. They didn't stop to catch their breath until they got to the main trail, which was a safe distance from the property. Marcus's heart was thumping so hard he could feel it in his throat as he leaned against a tree. Beside him, breathing heavily, Crenshaw's face was as white as wax. They turned their gaze back to Thornwood Farm, and their hearts sank at what they saw. Nothing had changed, but the house was still there, just as it had always been. Rising from the ceiling towards the sky, a column of black light, if such a thing could exist, pierced the clouds and vanished into the atmosphere. And forms started to emerge around that light. Though not completely human, the distorted proportions of these silhouettes carried echoes of humanity. There could be dozens or even more of them floating around the house, similar to moths around a fire. At that moment, Marcus realized the real significance of Thornwood's words. The ceremony was finished, the door was opened, and the people who had departed decades ago, the followers of Josiah Crane, were finally coming back. He couldn't predict what would happen next, but he was certain that Sevier County would never be the same because something ancient had reawakened in those mountains, and neither he nor Crenshaw could do anything to stop it. They needed to warn the... As he ran down the trail toward the village, Marcus Webb couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. The winter of 1908 had brought more than snow and cold to those mountains. It had brought the end of an era and the beginning of something no one would dare imagine. And somewhere behind them, in the house where it had all started, Elias. The descent down the mountain seemed to go on forever, as Marcus and Crainaw ran, stumbling among snow-covered roots and slick rocks, their hearts pounding frantically, a rhythm that echoed in their ears. The book remained pressed against the merchant's chest as if it were the only anchor keeping him connected to sanity. Behind them, that column of luminous darkness continued to rise toward the sky, visible even as Thornwood watched the completion of his work with a smile that finally reached his bright eyes. When they eventually arrived at the first cabins on the village's outskirts, the sun had already started to set, tinging the sky with orange hues that contrasted unsettlingly with the darkness emanating from the Thornwood farm. The shapes that floated around it multiplied with each passing moment, their distorted silhouettes dancing in patterns that seemed to follow an ancient and forgotten choreography. The villagers outside stopped what? Cranagh attempted to explain what they had seen, but words seemed inadequate to describe something that went beyond any ordinary human experience. How could he convince ordinary people, used to the everyday hardships of mountain life, that something impossible had awakened high above their heads? How could he persuade them to leave their homes, their lives, and everything they knew because of the two men who emerged from the forest with expressions of pure terror etched on their faces? Something that seemed to have emerged from a feverish nightmare? Some people, who had seen the lights and heard the chants, who had felt in their bones that something was seriously wrong in those mountains, believed right away. They started gathering their belongings without asking questions, following their gut feeling that it was time to leave, while others were more dubious. A farmer named Harold Briggs confronted Cranagh directly, demanding. Before leaving the land his family had farmed for generations, the sheriff pointed to the sky, to that impossibly tall column rising above the trees. But Briggs just shook his head, insisting there had to be a logical explanation for the phenomenon. Marcus watched these debates with an increasing sense of urgency. Every minute they spent arguing was a lost minute, a minute that those forces outside the farm had to fortify themselves, spread, and do whatever they intended to do with. Henry at a marsh was the one who ultimately turned the tide in that gullible community. The elderly woman had come down from her remote cabin, leaning on a twisted wooden cane with a determined expression that belied her advanced age. She stood in the middle of the village and started talking, her voice surprisingly clear and strong. Henrietta repeated the story she had told Marcus, but this time with even more emotion and detail, talking about her grandmother, Josiah Crane's community, and the warnings that. People listened in complete silence, their faces displaying a mixture of fear, disbelief, and something that seemed to be recognition. Many of them had their own stories, their own encounters with the inexplicable, that they had kept secret out of shame or fear of being deemed insane, but now faced with Henrietta's words and the undeniable evidence of that dark. A young man reported hearing voices calling his name as he passed the property, promises of knowledge and powers beyond human comprehension. An elderly woman described recurrent dreams in which she walked through endless corridors led by invisible hands. A woman confessed to seeing Thornwood's figure guarding her home for several nights, motionless as a statue, vanishing only when the first ray of sunlight touched the horizon. The evacuation started at nightfall, and entire families loaded what they could onto carts and horses, forming a silent procession that descended toward the lower valleys toward other villages and a light that was not light. As the stories mounted, the skeptics' resistance started to crumble. It was hard to maintain rationalism in the face of so much testimony, in the face of that impossible column that continued to pulsate in the darkening sky, and in the growing sense that something was very, very wrong. Some cried as they left behind homes their grandparents had built, while others kept stoic faces, determined not to look back. Marcus remained in the village until the last family had left, feeling a strange responsibility for those people, a connection forged by the fact that he was the one who first brought attention to the events at the Thornwood farm. Perhaps a voice, or perhaps none of this would have happened if he hadn't sought shelter in that house that stormy night. He thought to himself, everything would have happened exactly the same way, only without anyone to warn the villagers in time. As the last wagon vanished around the bend in the road, Crenshaw came up to him. The sheriff, who appeared to have aged years in a matter of hours, had lines of worry and exhaustion etched on his face, and held his grandfather's book in one hand and his gun in the other, as if both provided some sort of protection against what was to come. The two men took one final glance at the mountain. As abruptly as it had started, everything came to a halt. The column of darkness had grown until it formed a sort of dome that encircled Thornwood's farm, and the silhouettes dancing around it had multiplied countless times, creating ever more intricate patterns in the night sky. The column receded, the silhouettes disappeared, and the darkness that had engulfed that portion of the sky dissipated like mist in the morning sun, and in a matter of seconds there was no more visible evidence of what had. They never went back to that mountain. In the days and weeks that followed, the village remained deserted, its empty houses echoing only with the sound of the wind and the animals that gradually reclaimed the territory. Marcus and Crenshaw exchanged a look of bewilderment and trepidation. That sudden silence didn't seem like a victory, but rather a pause, an interval, a preparation for something that was yet to come. Thornwood Farm stood for many years afterward, its dark wooden structure defying time and the elements with a stubbornness that seemed supernatural. Travelers passing through the area reported seeing lights in its windows at night, and some swore they saw it. However, something had changed irrevocably in that place, something that made people give up, even before unpacking their belongings, months later when the memories of that night started to seem less real, less urgent. Marcus Webb left Sevier County and never came back to Tennessee. He carried Crenshaw's grandfather's book with him until the end of his days, studying its symbols and attempting to make sense of what he had seen in that house in the mountains. On some nights he would wake up to the sound of whispers in his ears. He heard distant singing when the wind blew in the right direction, but no one approached. No one dared cross that invisible circle that seemed to separate the property from the rest of the world. Sheriff Crenshaw continued to serve other communities for a few more years before retiring to a small coastal town as far away from any mountain that might remind him of that night. He died peacefully, surrounded by his family, but those present in his final moments claimed that his final words were a warning, a plea. Nobody knows for certain what happened to Elias Thornwood. Some say his body was discovered on the farm weeks later, sitting in his rocking chair in front of the unlit fireplace, with a calm smile on his lifeless lips. Others say he just disappeared, entering the door he had spent decades preparing, and finally meeting up with those who were waiting for him on the other side. The truth, like so much else about that property, is still veiled in mystery. The Appalachian Mountains contain many stories within their ancient, mist-shrouded slopes, and this is just one of them, a piece of darkness among so many others that lie silently beneath the earth and among the trees. Perhaps that is for the best. Maybe there are secrets that humanity is not ready to comprehend. Maybe there are doors that should stay closed, veils that should not be crossed. Who knows how many other farms, how many other houses, how many other doors lie scattered throughout those? We have reached the end of our journey together through one of the most unsettling stories ever to reverberate through these mountains, and I am grateful to everyone who has stayed up to this point, who has accompanied me on these gloomy paths and confronted the mysteries we have encountered. If this story resonated with you in any way, if it gave you the chill that only a good story can give, please think about subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. Your involvement makes all the difference and inspires me to keep sharing more stories like this. Additionally, please share your thoughts about this trip through the Appalachian Mountains in the comments section below. What was the most memorable moment for you? What unexpected revelation shocked you? I love reading your thoughts and exchanging ideas about these stories that captivate me so much. Until then, be careful and keep in mind that some doors are better closed.